So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session, which is on addressing information gaps for risk assessment and climate resilient investment decision making. My name is Jean Polutikov. I'm from Griffith University in Australia, where I'm director of the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility. And I'm the moderator for this exclusively male session. I've got 6 speakers this morning, and the way it's going to work, I'll introduce them to you in a moment, but we're just going to have a brief introduction to a deep dive session that took place earlier this week on building climate and disaster resilience in South Asia. And then, as you can see, the topic of the session involves both risk assessment and investment decision making. But actually, the way the session breaks down is that we have one presentation which concentrates mainly on risk assessment, and the others seem to be more devoted towards investment decision making. So we're going to take the one on risk assessment first. So the speakers for this session begin with Liping Zheng, who is an advisor on South Asia with the ADB, and he's going to make the introduction to the deep dive session. And then we have a presentation from Michihiro Oi, who is with the Global Environment Bureau of the Ministry of the Environment in Japan. And he's going to talk about a decision support adaptation platform, which is currently being built for Japanese adaptation practitioners. We'll then hear from Paul Watkis, who is an associate at the Stockholm Environment Institute and an independent consultant and an environmental economist. We'll hear from Jun Rentschler, who is with the World Bank, Nathan Reeve, who is also with the ADB and a specialist for the Central and West Asia region, a specialist in climate change. And finally, we'll hear from Nathan Reeve, who's with the ADB, and Peter Stone, who's with Arup. So the majority of these people are economists, so I don't know anything about economics. I'm just a poor geographer by training. Peter is a civil engineer, so he's a little bit different. Okay, so we'll see how we go with this session. I will endeavour to make some intelligent interventions, as a good moderator should, but you'll forgive me if I fail somewhat in that respect, not being an economist. So we'll begin with Liping Zheng, who's going to talk about the deep dive session that took place earlier this week. Liping, please come up.
Okay.
Oh, you want to speak from there? Carry on.
No need to sit there. Good morning. Oh, no need. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to share with you that what we are South Asia Department of ADB we are doing and how we do in addressing climate change risk. It's been saying that increasing climate change risk we're threatening the sustainable development. Yeah. And among other causes of this problem, we believe it's a lack of knowledge. Yeah. Number one is that general lack of awareness and understanding on the science and impact of climate change, and lack of information base for decision support system to mainstream climate change. Number three, insufficient knowledge sharing mechanism for scaling up investment in climate change, and poor technology transfer and best practice sharing mechanism. And based on this understanding, we South Asia Department, we are South Asia Department. Wait, no, nothing. Yeah, okay. South Asia Department, we are initiating a couple of things. Among others, we have a publication, Climate Action South Asia, and this is in response to the request from our DMC. Under this is an umbrella. Under this umbrella, we have four pillars. The first one is the climate change risk screening. The number two is the knowledge transfer. The number three is the capacity development. Number four is the knowledge sharing, knowledge development, and knowledge sharing. And we already every year we have several publications, and we among the DMC we share this. Our current initiative in South Asia Department is that we develop and apply tools and methodology to screen projects for climate risk and mitigation potential. Once we have a new project, we will do screening based on the later I will introduce the details. And then we develop and manage climate change database and knowledge base. And we support incorporation of adaptation and mitigation option into the project design. Yeah. Still have time, huh? Actually, we have a regional TA. It's a knowledge-based TA, and under this TA, we build a database of climate change, and then we put it together and develop into a risk screening tools. Okay. So the under this screening process, we will analyze hazard using the hazard database, exposed database, vulnerability database, coping and adaptive capacity, and the risk and impact. The possibility. Right, we put it together and then come up with the risk category. Tell the project office what's the risk? It's a high, medium, or low, and what will be the mitigation measures we are going to take. Okay. Currently when there's a project coming, okay, there's a project information there, and then in our database we already know that what will be the hazard, what will be the exposure, what will be the vulnerability, and also the capacity of the project team, the executing agency. With all of this information, we come up with the screening report. We call it CRS report. Yeah, and with this report, if the risk under this report, we will tell them what will be the risk. Is a high, medium, or low. If it's a low, we will not go deeper. But if it's a medium and or high, we will discuss with project officer to make some adjustment. Do we need to do this way, or we need to have some adjustment in some component or locations? And then further, after we decided, we will do the climate change risk and vulnerability assessment. Yeah, with this assessment, it's a go more details. Yeah, we need to also more details information on the hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity, and come up with a strategy and recommendation for the project team. Yeah. And actually, I still have some time. I just want to share one thing is that before all this was done by our specialist, but we in the future we decide that to delegate this to our project officer. But for most of the project officer, it's not possible that everyone know how to do the evaluation, how to do the screening. You cannot expect everyone is a climate change specialist. So recently, we developed a screening tool based on our database, hazard, exposed vulnerability. We actually under the TA, we work for more than almost 5 years. We collect a lot of data. We develop more than 2,000 of climate change maps, and we put this together using a special software. Now when project office, they just enter the project information and answer some questions. The system can generate an climate risk screening report based on ADB's template. In the first day in the deep dive, we already demonstrate how to use this one. For now, we already have Maldives and Bangladesh, 2 countries data there, and very soon we will have Sri Lanka one, because Sri Lanka's map now they are submitting these days, so we will upload it. Means that very soon we will have a database that we concluding these kind of things. Is the operation, the operation automation. Yeah, we can let the project office to do it, and then next year we will include to India and Nepal, right? To let project office can handle it by themselves. Okay. Yeah. Okay, that's all. I saved 1 minute for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction to the work, the risk screening that goes on in ADB as an operational procedure for their project evaluation. So that's very encouraging to see climate change and adaptation being embedded. So the next presentation is from Michihiro Oi, who's going to talk about the adaptation platform currently being constructed in Japan. Michihiro, please.
Thank you very much, and good morning to ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michihiro Oi. I'm from the Ministry of the Environment of Japan. So I'm a national officer in charge of the climate change adaptation, and in the position to assist local governments to take adaptation actions depending on the situations of each local governments. So today I'm going to talk about experiences in adaptation policy in Japan to develop information infrastructure or information platform with the aim for filling the information gap and for providing subnational governments the information and to assist their adaptation planning. Okay, let me start to introduce Japan's new law for adaptation, Climate Change Adaptation Act, or CCAA. You may remember that my Vice Minister, Mr. Takahashi, presented this law in the first plenary session of this forum on the first day. And this is, I believe, quite a unique law in the world, in the sense that it focuses on climate change adaptation only. So this slide shows just the 3 key points of the law, and I also add to the word that this law was adopted by the former Diet session in June this year, and will come into force from the 1st of December this year. So 3 key points. The first, this law aims to enhance cooperation and coordination among ministries and the newly developed National Adaptation Plan. Actually, Japan has already had NAP, which was formulated in 2015, 3 years ago. But the current NAP is just which ministry do what. So that's just a compilation of policies and measures undertaken by each ministry. But under this law, we will reformulate our NAP to cover more comprehensive and coordinated manner. And the second point is that maybe it is the most important aim of this law is to promote subnational adaptation planning or actions by encouraging local governments to develop their local adaptation planning, LAP, yes. And the third point is that in order to help local officers and stakeholders to setting and implementing their local adaptation plan, National Institute for Environmental Studies, NIES, is designated as a hub institution of adaptation information. So this NIES will support local governments to develop local adaptation plan and to take adaptation measures and policies by local governments. And this slide shows the climate change adaptation platform. We call this APLAT, which is the key tool for the NIES to assist the local governments. Actually, this platform was developed 2 years ago, but will be further improved under this new law. So this platform aims to assist the local adaptation planning and actions, as I said. And this is a web-based information platform, so everybody can access this site. I'm sorry, most information is written in Japanese, but it's very helpful for the Japanese local governments and the stakeholders. And this slide, the platform shows many kinds of information on climate risk assessment and impacts and how to adopt these impacts. And it also provides the general overview of the national overview as well as the local further downscaled information in each prefecture level. Now Japan is wishing to outreach our experience. And this is an example to assist the development of this kind of information platform in other Asian and Pacific countries. In Thailand, for example, Japanese Ministry of the Environment and Thailand Ministry for Natural Resource and Environment, MONRE, has a bilateral cooperation to develop the information platform, so-called TPLAT in Thailand. Now the platform is almost ready, and the information is now compiling in this site. And we are also wishing to conduct the same activities in Indonesia as well. And further wish is to connect this kind of national-based information platform as an Asia-Pacific Adaptation Information Platform, APPLAT. This platform with the aim to establish by 2020 to share climate risk information with wide range of stakeholders in the Asia-Pacific regions. So this is, again, the web-based information platform, but not only put the information on the platform is not enough, and it's important to develop some kind of support toolkit, how to utilize the information on this site. And also it's important to build the capacity of local officers and stakeholders to utilize the information and to develop their plan, and also to conduct their projects in each region. So Japan will take a lead in these 3 actions to develop this set and to develop support toolkits, and others to help capacity building. These 3 pillars will be finally launched by 2020, or hopefully by next year. So I would like to conclude my presentation by several key messages, and maybe first, local adaptation planning and actions are necessary, but information gap becomes a barrier even in Japan in promoting subnational actions. And information platform and the center of excellence to collect, manage, and disseminate the information is the key to overcome this information gap. And thirdly, cooperation among ministries and related research institutions under the ministry are important, according to the Japan's experience, and in developing this kind of information platform. And we have several challenges and initiatives in national or subnational basis. We will to enhance local resilience through enforcement of new law. And from the international or bilateral context, we will assist Asian Pacific developing countries to develop an information platform, as well as to connect this information as an AP plan, the more wider platform for everybody. Okay, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
So Michihiro finished before time, and he does exactly what I do back in Australia, where we've also constructed a decision adaptation platform for local government. So what we found, and I'm going to ask you a question now, what we found was that we needed to talk a lot to our local governments to find out exactly what it was that they needed before we began. So I wondered what procedures you went through to discover from your users what their information needs were.
Yes, it's very important question, and actually, I think it depends on each local government, because the needs for adaptation is very depending on the situation in the local governments. And basically, we will have a bilateral talk with the local governors and to find out which is the priority area for each local government. So it's very tough work, but we will continue to our efforts to keep continue to this kind of communication.
Thank you. And it's not cheap either, is it? So thank you, Michihiro. And the next speaker now, as we move more into thinking about decision making for investments, is Paul Watkis, who is, as I said, an environmental economist, who is an associate with the Stockholm Environment Institute and based in the UK. Paul.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Take a bit of time so I can go across. What we do and have here is a session on information gaps for risk assessment and decision making. And maybe this is good because I hope to sort of fill the gap a little bit by talking about an information gap when doing a risk assessment for an investment decision. And that information gap is on the economics. So maybe a little bit of background. We're talking about making resilient investments. And I think it's important early on to say there are two types of investments that we are interested in. One is where we are doing something anyway, and we want to make it resilient. I'm building a new road, and I want to make sure that that road is there for the next 20 years and doesn't get washed away with climate change. The second type of investment is where I am specifically making a climate resilient investment. I have increasing storm surges and I need to do some coastal protection because I'm already seeing climate change. And that's a different thing, but it's equally relevant. Now, the key thing I want to highlight is that we are now spending lots of money on these type of investments. The MDBs, the multilateral development banks, track how much money they spend on adaptation. And last year they tracked that they spent $7.4 billion on it. That's a lot of money. And as you know, ADB has its own targets and those are set to increase. Now, the thing about spending money on adaptation or resilience is people then turn around and say, well, what are you spending the money on? Where did your $7.4 billion go? Is that a good investment? And so increasingly people are saying, what's the value for money of what you're investing in? And here when I say value for money, I'm talking about, is it efficient? Is it effective? Is it equitable? And the underlying concept here is we only have a finite resource available. If we're going to invest it, we'll be able to deliver much more adaptation if we use that money wisely. And that's what I want to talk about. And I want to talk about it specifically in the context of doing a climate risk assessment or a CRVA in the context of investment decisions and the fact that information on costs and benefits is a really big gap. So how do I know it's a gap? I'm not just making it up. I do tend to make things up, so I've got to have some evidence. I was part of a team that went out and did a really extensive literature review on the costs and benefits of adaptation. We found 700 studies. It's in a fully searchable inventory if you want to access it at the website that's on the page, on the Econadapt project. And what we found was the information is growing on the costs and benefits of resilience or adaptation, but it's not really in a form that's very useful for us yet. Why is that? Well, we know something about some sectors and not so much about others. You know, there's lots that we know about how to build a coastal dike and how much it will cost, but not so much in other areas. And much of the information that we do have is very academic. So what it will typically do is it will say, we think we're going to get big climate change in 2040. What do we need to do? And it will do that within a framework that, if I can be honest, cheats. So it says, if we have 0.5 meter of sea level rise by 2050, how much is it going to cost us to do that? And what we've learned over the last 10 years is that's not the right question, so it doesn't deliver the right answers. If I'm here trying to make an investment decision, if I'm ADB, for example, I need to know what I need to do today, not what I need to do in 2040. And this becomes really difficult for two reasons. The first reason is, as you all know, climate change is uncertain. You can probably see that little picture at the top, and that's just a rainfall projection for a country in South Asia that shows, when I look at my 23 global climate models, I get very different answers. Half the models say it's going to get wetter, half the models say it's going to get drier. I'm an investor today. The question is, what do I do given I can't predict the future? If I know what's going to happen, it's easy. And one of the things is what we've tended to find is people approach this problem of uncertainty and make what I would say are not necessarily good investment decisions. They will either say, well, let's just take the middle, because that seems to be, broadly okay. And if you do that, then you're clearly not really answering or addressing the question of uncertainty. The other thing they'll do is they'll say, let's take the worst case and let's just adapt to that. So if you want, I have 23 climate models. They'll pick model 23 that has the worst case scenario. That's one way of adapting to the problem, but it's not a very efficient way of adapting to the problem, because what you're saying is, I have 23 outcomes, 22 of which I know are going to be the wrong. Or this investment will only be the right option for one of 23 future outcomes. So it's clearly not a rational use of money unless you particularly have to be precautionary. And there's another thing that's really rather nasty. If I can be honest, economists don't like adaptation. And the reason they don't like adaptation is because of this picture at the bottom in blue and red. If I come and I say, I want to spend some money today to address future climate change impacts in 2040, that doesn't really work from a classic cost-benefit analysis because of the issue of discounting. And maybe a way to think about this is I go to the bank, I say, I want to borrow some money today, and they say, that's fine. When's the return going to come? When are you going to pay the money back? And you're effectively saying, well, the money that I will get back in return won't be until 20 years' time. And clearly the bank will say, well, maybe I'll pick somebody else and you can go and ask someone else for your investment loan. So it's a way of saying that this is really, really difficult. And to try and get around this problem, we've invented a whole host of what we call decision-making under uncertainty approaches. And you'll hear lots of people talking about robust decision-making and real options analysis. And they are one route to this, but they come with their own challenges. So we've got some information. I want to highlight a couple of points. This is partly about data gaps, let's be honest. But that's not the end of the story. Two things. Firstly, if we're going to use information, we need to look at the decision in which we are using that information. We need to think about the user, as we've already heard, and actually, it's more important to think about the information you need for a decision than it is to get the information per se. And then the other thing we've learned over, and we've probably learned this the hard way, is that adaptation isn't a simple technical response. It's a social institutional issue. It's about the processes and the institutions and the organizations. So it's as important for me to understand how that information on costs and benefits is going to be used in investment decisions as it is to have the information. And we sometimes find these really nasty issues. And there's one that we've been highlighting at ADB where economic analysis comes quite late in the project investment cycle. But if we want to change things, we need to do that early in the cycle. And so we have a process barrier. So we're never going to solve the problem with information alone. We have to solve it with a combination of information, process, and decision thinking. Now, how do we do that? Well, I think there's a couple of points that I want to highlight here that link back to climate risk assessment as a technique. CRA isn't like environmental impact assessment. There is no standardized best practice yet. And what we tend to see, if I can be honest, because I'm a practitioner as well, is someone will come along and give us a nice 50-page report of lots of climate projection scenarios. And that's the way that they start their climate risk assessment. If I could say one thing that you should take back from this talk, if nothing else, is that's the wrong way to do it. The right way to do it is to think about the decision and the project first and frame your decision and only then look to see what information you need. Otherwise, the science drives the analysis and you end up with 100 pages of climate projections and 2 pages on adaptation. And we'd like to change that. And I think the other thing that I really want to stress is not all resilience problems are equal. So we need to have a toolkit when we come to this and not think that there is one simple method or standardized set of information that solves all our problems. And one of the things we've been working on very hard is looking at that decision-making under uncertainty and trying to say, well, when do you apply certain techniques? And it's to do with a number of characteristics which we call the 3 Ls, which are the lifetime, the lock-in, and the level of precaution. Looking at my time, I can probably quickly do this. If you have a longer-lived investment decision, you have to think more about climate change because it's more important. If you have a shorter investment, it's more about short-term climate variability and the climate that you're exposed to today. Similarly, some projects have a lot of lock-in. They're very difficult to change later on. If I build a major bridge today, it's there for 100 years. It's very costly to retrofit. And that's different than if I have a short-term investment that doesn't have that same degree of lock-in. And also, sometimes we make investment decisions now that we say these have to be right. These are the sorts of critical infrastructure projects that can't go wrong. A major hydro project with a large storage, you cannot get dam failure because then the downstream impacts are catastrophic. And what we can do is we can look at those characteristics. Now, I can't do this slide justice in 35 seconds. All I want to highlight is that we have condensed this and said, well, there's 10 ways through the problem. 10 ways is far too much, but there's different ways that you can think about a resilient investment decision and then try and get an answer that takes account of these. And maybe just look at the left-hand side. To condense this, you either do something to the design now, or you do it later with some iterative adaptation, or else you do something different that is a non-technical response. And finally, we should always remember there is the option to do nothing. So what we've been working with is trying to find out, as you go through your investment framework and look at your decision, trying to map these types of characteristics to adaptation decisions. So to finish, we're very interested in what we are calling low regret adaptation. That's where we think we need to have more investment in information because that's where we need to have the greatest priority for early resilience. low regret options that are good to do now and have a strong economic case. And at the same time, we're very interested in building these iterative pathways and having information that allows us to inform those so that we can think about these longer term issues within these iterative pathways. And finally, just to highlight and to finish, it's not just about information. It's about learning and case studies and communities of practice, but it's also about how users are going to use that information within the organizations and the processes that they have to work with. If it doesn't fit within the process, it doesn't get done. And I think if we can do those things together, we'll have a very powerful way forward in improving climate risk investment and decision making. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I remember that. Lifetime lock-in, level of precaution. Yes. So the next presentation is from Jun Rentschler, who is an economist with the World Bank. Jun.
Thank you. Good morning. So this is maybe more of a pitch than a presentation, and it links in very well with what we've just heard. So I'm an economist at the World Bank's Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management Unit, and part of what we do is to design projects that make sense and that hold up to the many uncertainties that we face. And as part of that, we are rethinking the ways in which we make decisions about climate change adaptation and some of the tools we've just heard in the previous presentation. So I want to start with a little illustration of this, and this will require your participation. So get ready to raise your hand. Imagine you're a DRM expert in a city, and the city is doing a major investment in an urban mobility project. It's a BRT system, $400 million. The problem is our city floods very frequently. So your task is to design a flood protection system that protects our investment. And if we don't do a good job, it will mean that our investment gets damaged, our buses get flooded, the equipment, people can't get to their jobs. It will cause major disruptions, and probably the damages are more than the initial investment. The good news is we get 30 years of rainfall data to work with and to guide us through this process. So I'll give you 30 seconds to think about what level of protection we should put in place in order to protect our BRT system. While you think, I'll give you some more context. So first of all, the maximum rainfall that we experienced in this 30-year window was a 400 millimeter rainfall event. We can compute probabilities, which will tell us that the 400 millimeter event is about a 1 in 50-year event. That's almost a once in a lifetime kind of disaster. And so my question to you is now, what kind of protection level would you choose based on this data that we have available? And by the way, this is more than we very often have, because this kind of rainfall data is not always available at a 30-year window. So maybe we'll do a quick show of hands. Who thinks it should be, say, 200? Nobody. 250? 300? 350? I see a few hands. 400. So now we're getting into the once in a lifetime kind of quite a number of hands. 450, 500. Number of hands. So I see quite a lot of hesitant DRM experts here. Can we agree on 500? So let's go with 500. That's a 1 in 500 event, 500-year event. That's much more precautious than what we usually choose. The problem is we put this in place and built this infrastructure, and 1 year later, we get a new data point. It completely changes our probabilities. What used to be 1 in 50 years is now 1 in 10 years. Just 1 year after we built our investment, our project gets flooded. And this, by the way, is real data from India. I'm not making this up. And we could call this based on a true story of real events. And I should add that this is just the rainfall climate side of uncertainty. When we built a BRT system, we have a whole range of uncertainties from traffic flows, economic growth, urbanization, population growth. All of that we need to take into account when we build infrastructure like this. So the question is, when we predict our next, when we predict the future climate, here we failed at making a simple prediction just about the next year. How do we feel about making predictions based on climate models for, say, the year 2040? Because this is probably how long these infrastructure investments that we're talking about will live. So that's the lifetime that we just heard about. And we also heard there are several models that give us very different predictions for the same place, and there are many different models. These all come with different assumptions and scenarios, so this multiplies and add into that urban growth, population growth, and a whole range of other uncertainties that we need to consider. So really my whole point here is that the approach of predict and then design your infrastructure based on that, your adaptation infrastructure based on your prediction, doesn't really work when we have these long lifetime projects with a large number of uncertainties, where our predictions are most likely to be very shaky. So I want to show you very quickly, and this is maybe the pitch here, an example of a robust decision-making process that we went through with the government of Mozambique. In 2015, Mozambique experienced severe flooding, which caused huge losses to livelihoods, agricultural production. And as one consequence of this event, the government decided to invest massively into resilient roads, climate and flood resilient road networks. Now, the costs and benefits of doing this kind of investment in climate resilient roads were quite easily identified. Here are some of them. The problem begins when you try to start putting numbers on these, especially in the long term. I mentioned there's a whole range of uncertainties that will change the estimates and that will change the cost-benefit ratio when you do a standard cost-benefit analysis to the positive or negative, depending on what kind of predictions you make about these uncertainties. So rather than picking a prediction about each of these uncertainties, what we did is to generate 2,000 scenarios which cover the whole possible spectrum of possible outcomes of the future. So these scenarios include, for instance, the current climate, a low climate change scenario, high climate change scenario, and then combine these with different values for different uncertainties. Then through local stakeholder consultations and consultations with the government, we came up with a list of 5 potential investment options. So this is specifically for one district in Mozambique. And now for each of these 5 investment options, we did 2,000 cost-benefit analyses. What you see, the result of that you can see here. What you see is the cost-benefit ratio on the vertical axis and the 5 investment options on the horizontal axis. You see that investment option 3 performs better in almost all of the 2,000 scenarios, better than the other 4 investment options. So even in the worst 5% of outcomes, it still performs almost as good as the average other 4 investment options. This is what we call the least regret option. And I realize I'm going very fast through this. This whole presentation is actually a 10-minute version of a 2-hour workshop, so we can do that later if you're interested. But to summarize, this was the first part we went through. Predict and act is what we learned. That's what I learned in an economics education. We predict, we come up with a probability, we do a cost-benefit analysis. If we're thorough, we'll do a sensitivity analysis to see how our cost-benefit ratio changes to small changes in our predictions. But that's really the standard decision-making process that we go through. Decision-making and uncertainty, rather than decision-making and uncertainty acknowledges that we are not very good at making predictions, especially in the long term. So rather than doing predictions, we start with a list of all the possible strategies that we have, all the investment options and alternatives that we can think of. And then, first of all, we eliminate those options that will lead to completely unacceptable outcomes. So we heard about the dam example, for instance, that could lead to large loss of life. Then we go through this list of options and see which one performs better in a whole wide range of potential future scenarios. And by going through this process, the goal is to identify strategies that are not necessarily best for our most likely predicted outcome, but that are best under a whole range of possible uncertain futures. And with that, I leave you. Thank you.
What your time horizon is for those scenarios? How far in the future are you looking to when you...
So how far in the future are we looking? It will depend. So for instance, it will depend. You have economists in front of you. It will depend very much on what we're looking at. So in the urban scenario.
So in the particular example you showed for Mozambique, that was interesting.
So for Mozambique, it included, for instance, areas that were rapidly urbanizing. And the issue is when you design road networks, they will probably be there for centuries. That's what we saw in Europe, for instance, that when you put in a certain urban structure, you just have to walk through central London. Once you design a grid, it's very difficult to change. So you have extremely long time horizons.
Your climate scenarios under 2100.
Exactly. And so the uncertainty is the climate uncertainty is only one and maybe not the largest of all the possible uncertainties that we're facing.
Thank you for that possibly clear clarification. I'm not sure. I could talk about that for several hours, but I guess, June, that's the issue here, that we're trying to squeeze things into 10 minutes. The next presentation is by Nathan Reeve from the ADB, and is a specialist in climate change. Yeah.
Sure. Do I point up here or down here? Okay. All right. Thank you very much. So yes, my name is Nathan Riv. I am a climate change specialist, but I'm not an economist, nor am I a climate scientist. So I'm going to preface this discussion by saying that I'm sort of sidestepping the issue a little bit and talking more about from a perspective of somebody in ADB who processes and administers climate change projects, as well as someone who has an oversight on our climate programming within the department. So, as we know, there's a vast array of tools to guide us through the analysis of the climate science and adaptation options. Risk screening tools, which may help us identify key risks to a project, crunchy profiles, which might help us identify key areas of concern, climate data and projections for more detailed analysis, decision-making tools, options analysis, economic analysis, engineering guidance, which may specify how best to design something in light of future climate changes, guidance on how to integrate better social and gender issues in climate adaptation, and of course, impact analysis and an evaluation of projects. So what I hope to do in this presentation is a fair, hopefully not overly simple argument, is to ask the question, when we're talking about improving our analysis and improving the tools for adaptation, what are we actually referring to, and what are the intended benefits? So just to take it back and put some context here, when in ADB, we can think of our projects in sort of two broad categories, as was mentioned previously, I believe by Paul. Largely our projects you might consider just climate proofing. This is a project that is not necessarily predicated on climate change, but we want to make sure from perhaps a more safeguards perspective that the risks to the infrastructure have been addressed and it's designed appropriately. In this case, we are dealing with adaptation costs that are the incremental costs to the project above and beyond how the project would have been designed and costed in the absence of climate change considerations. In the next, the next category is what I would call climate programming. And this is, as we know, where we need to get our portfolio towards if we are indeed going to meet the broader development partners' targets, including ADB's targets, for adaptation in 2020 and 2030. These are projects which have been predicated on climate risks, and the projects perhaps have been designed from a more bottom-up concept development and elaboration process. Now, the projects may not have a content or nature which is particularly different from the climate-proof projects, but perhaps they have perhaps they've been selected, or the target areas have been selected on the basis of climate risks. Perhaps you've included things which you may not otherwise have done, or perhaps the project may not have been done if we weren't thinking about climate change. And as a result, you can consider adaptation costs to be up to 100% of the project components. Now, going from this climate proofing to climate programming, we may imagine we have a nice, smooth transition where as we do more climate programming, our costs per benefit are falling, and we have a nice progression and development. And again, I hope I'm not making too much of a meal of a fairly simple argument. But here I present a fairly illustrative or indicative curve of cost benefit for improvements in adaptation. So here we have the idealized long-term development. As we go forward, as we put in more effort, we're going to get more benefit of resilience per unit of effort. And unit effort here, I'm calling effort for transaction costs, investment costs. But actually with adaptation, like all innovations, we're probably going to go through sort of cycles of S-curves. In the beginning, we may have, so for the climate proofing, in the beginning, we may have some inertia, difficulties in getting the institutional arrangements around it. So as we put in more effort, we're not going to get much benefit. But then as we go up the curve and as we are able to scale up our climate proofing, we get more and more benefits. But then we're going to start running out of things to climate proof. And we may have declining returns from our effort towards resilience. So to get more adaptation benefit, we're going to have to move into a new way of thinking, new process, and this is what we're calling climate programming. So in this context, where does the analytics fit? And my question here is, when we're talking about improving our analytics, are we doing it because we think it's going to leapfrog us from climate proofing up into this climate programming regime? Or is it because, what's going to happen is, are these improved analytics going to provide some improvements, but really we're going to get diminishing returns? And I highlight this point on the climate proofing just for arguments. I'm not saying that's necessarily where we are. There's no units anywhere here. So again, my fairly simple argument here is that when we talk about analytics and we talk about improving our analytics, the limited resources that we have should be out towards those analytics, should be allocated with a view to what particular benefits we want to get out of them in the particular context to which those apply. And in particular, it's useful to structure our thinking around what are the real world bottlenecks to improving our adaptation and increasing our adaptation investments. And what are the practical outcomes that we can achieve with those analytics? To give some examples, broad categories of where I see improvements could arise. Again, non-exhaustive. Number one is impact evaluation, monitoring, and reporting of projects, both in terms of helping us design as well as to see where what we're actually achieving with our projects. Now, M&E is something that is certainly getting more visibility. We had a deep dive on it the other day. And certainly among our development partners, the donors, the country partners, M&E on adaptation is something that is absolutely front of mind, and additional work is necessary. Number two is simplification and standardization. Now, this is two things, really. One is it sort of touches on the trade-off between theoretical robustness and real-world practicality. What we experience sometimes at ADB, and perhaps in other development partners, is that we have perhaps robust guidance on economic evaluation or other things, but we may not have the data or the resources or the time or even incentives to actually use the full robust approach. That means it can fall to the wayside. In addition, we may actually find that sometimes project by project, we're doing the same analysis each time. We're digging through the same model runs, we're digging through the same historical data. So ways in which we can simplify the approach to either designing a project or assessing the risks would be extremely valuable. And certainly this is a process that we are doing within ADB. Prioritization touches on this a little bit as well. This has to do with ways in which, again, it's somewhat along the lines of simplification, but what we do find is that it's hard, and countries may not necessarily have prioritization for their own development needs. So the idea that they would have a prioritization scheme for their adaptation is perhaps ambitious. So improving ways in which we can identify projects and sort them and identify which ones we need to work on first would be extremely valuable. The fourth one is what I call first mile consultation, which I think is more a process rather than an analytical tool. And this touches upon what I see, at least internally, as a weak link in developing our climate programming, which is the gap between what we might know as the needs of the country, perhaps specified in a well-structured or well-intentioned NDC, to getting bankable concepts from that. And if you talk to the stakeholders, they may not know how to get from A to B. So this consultative process is what we've tried to do in certain instances and has worked well, and something that we see as a key area to develop our climate programming. And finally, couldn't finish by not mentioning, of course, the data collection and reconstruction and projections. Many of the countries, certainly in our region, small countries, less developed countries, don't have the historical data and don't have necessarily the precision on their model runs yet to make good decisions. So with that, I've got 10 seconds and I'll probably finish on time. Thank you.
Thank you. I can see some themes beginning to emerge around worrying about the reliability of the data and restricting your problems to exactly what is needed to arrive at solutions. But we have one more presentation to come, and that's from Peter Stones, who's a civil engineer with Arup based in Singapore. Peter.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me here today and for allowing me to join this esteemed panel. What I'm going to talk about for the brief 10 minutes sits somewhere, I hope, nicely between some of the things we've heard just now, which is sort of national and city scale, and then some of the things that we've heard around financing, which is maybe more at implementation or project scale, if you like. So what we've been doing in Singapore is looking at a project which is broadly called Systems Resilience of Islands Within a State. And we're working with a number of private developers who are interested in this arena, if you like, and we're trying to help them understand an approach towards systems-based thinking for resilience. And I should say that this approach goes, we hope, will go beyond just climate change resilience, but more broadly into organizational resilience, etc. So I think we all know the broader issues. So I just put a slide up to remind us. And I think the reason why we're starting to see a lot more private sector engagement with the topic is essentially these predictions and the fact that adaptation options are available to reduce the risks. I think that message makes it very clear that the risks are not avoidable. Adaptation options are essentially necessary. So that's why we find that the private sector is starting to become much more engaged in talking to us around these issues. So who am I talking about when I say private sector and islands within a state? Essentially, it's an issue around scale, geography, and complexity. The scale is somewhat less than a city and somewhat more than a single intervention. So there's the very obvious islands within a state. This is an example of a project we've worked on recently in Myanmar. It's an island earmarked for development for tourism and leisure off the coast of Myanmar. It's very obviously an island and very obviously within a state. Slightly less obvious is the second example of an island within a state, which is a university campus. This happens to be a university campus located in Singapore. And essentially, we've tailored our project around systems thinking to this type of private sector developer. And essentially, our definition is around the physicality of what is an island within a state. It doesn't necessarily need to be a physical island surrounded by water, but a single entity, geographically speaking. There needs to be people. People essentially are the cause of the complexity which necessitates this kind of systems-based thinking that I'll describe. There needs to be a degree of complexity around operation. There are both internal and external stakeholders and internal and external governance processes. So these islands have a degree of control over their own destiny, if you like, but they have to operate within a wider framework around which they may or may not have a degree of influence. And why do we find these developers and private sector bodies are becoming more interested? First one's very simple, financials. Everybody's aware of the risks, I think, at this stage, or becoming aware at least of the risks and how it can impact essentially their bottom line. What's interesting is most of the private sector bodies that we've been talking to are also very worried about their KPIs. It's not necessary that they need to show a financial benefit, but if they can show a benefit that accrues towards a KPI, they can really demonstrate the value and show the benefit of what they're doing. The clients that we're working with, they face this issue around complexity, and essentially the complexity of the issue around resilience of these sorts of islands within a state can be blinding. And a lot of private sector developers know there's an issue, know there's a problem, but essentially struggle to understand where to begin. And they believe that going straight in and doing a specific measure, at least that's getting in on the right track. But that misses the opportunity of looking holistically at the island as a system and how best to make strategic interventions. So what we're doing is we're developing tools that essentially will allow influencers within the private sector body to demonstrate value of potential interventions across the system to decision makers. And how we're doing that. Okay, this is a very simplified systems diagram looking at 10 subsystems. We've been working with the developer, or these private sector developers, and we've come up with a range of subsystems, as we're calling them, or system components. And we're trying to work with each of them, because every system is unique, to understand exactly what those subsystem components might be. And so these are just some examples around transport, mobility, organizational structure, governance frameworks, et cetera, And we've created a list of essentially 25 standard subsystems and 5 that are somewhat flexible and can be chopped and changed depending on the stakeholder we're working with. And what we do is we try and map how each of these subsystems relates, integrates, and works with the other subsystems. This is just diagrammatic, obviously, but essentially what we're saying is every part of an island within a state affects every other part of an island within a state. To what degree, that's where the complexity comes in. And that's what we're trying to capture on behalf of these stakeholders. And what we hope this will allow them to do is to understand, if I go and make my intervention around, let's say transport, for example, there will be obvious benefits towards a transport-related outcome. There may be other benefits towards visitorship or number of students present. There may be other benefits towards sort of public perception around your degree to influence government, etc., etc. And typically those kind of benefits would go somewhat unnoticed by the intervention. So what we're hoping is by creating this well-mapped and well-understood image of what the system looks like, we'll be able to demonstrate to any stakeholder and say, if you invest your money on this intervention, you'll be able to see these effects and these trickle-down effects from that. And the objective will be to quantify, at least qualify the impact and the potential benefit that's a result. So this is essentially what I'm saying. We start off with an island within a state. We derive the system map of how all of the subsystem components relate to each other and how strongly. Then we assess that system in terms of its resilience. We apply shocks and stresses to that system. We see how a shock permeates the system and it impacts the other subsystems within the overall. Then we can be strategic around where we make our intervention to reduce the shock or stress or alleviate the shock or stress, and how we capture the benefits of that. And this is the bit that the stakeholders we've been working with are getting a sense of the real value. What they need is this mechanism to be able to say, okay, I will invest in my transport solution, but demonstrate to the senior management, or to their funding body, or to their investors, the other benefits that are accruing, be they monetized or not, and really follow it through the system and say, overall, the whole system is uplifted because of this intervention. There's just one more slide. Oh, there's two more, sorry. So this is the what we're trying to achieve, essentially understand the system, the current system, if you like, really derive a deep dive into the interdependencies of the system and how each component relates to every other component. We want to apply the shocks and stresses that we're assessing for and trace the impact of those shocks and stresses as they permeate through the system. And then once we understand how those shocks and stresses affect the system as a whole, we identify and quantify benefits of specific interventions across the system. Just one more slide. Perhaps not. Oh, there is. Okay. And I'll just leave on this final note that from our experience working with private sector developers, they come to us and say, you as the industry essentially need to provide them with the tools that essentially decision makers with the best information, the right tools, and to allow them to make the best choice and essentially ensure the successful outcomes. So with that, I will. Thank you.
That's nice. That was a really good, slightly more general summing up of what we've heard. So we covered a huge amount of ground in this session. So please try now to cast your mind back to where we began, thinking about the work that ADB is doing in South Asia with Liping Zheng, and then the decision support platform from Japan. Then we heard the slightly more technical considerations of the shortcomings of data and information and how you can overcome those. And then Peter Stones has given us a really nice general finale, I think, to the panel session. So now we've got time for questions. So taking into account everything that's been said, I invite you to come forward with questions, and then at the very end, gentlemen, I will ask you for a final take-home message from each of you, just to warn you that is coming. So so the lady at the back now, do we have yes, we do have a roving mic.
Good morning. My name is Kai Kim. I'm an independent consultant, and I have a question from the gentleman from the Ministry of Environment from Japan, Mr. Yeah. So I thank you very much for your presentation, and I was really interested in learning about this platform that you've set up to support local governments in that adaptation planning. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about what efforts are being made to help the specific line ministries in developing, so that to inform them about climate risk to their overall strategies. So, for example, health and agriculture, infrastructure ministries in particular.
So that's a very precise question. Do you want to answer that now?
Okay, thank you for your question. And I'm sorry I cannot deeper to provide more concrete information in my presentation. And in our national platform, and APLAT, currently we provide as many information as possible, basically. So this covers many kinds of information on the risk assessment of climate change, including the impact to agriculture, forest, fisheries, as well as the impact to the ecosystems, impact to the human health, and so on. And these information, some of them come from the National Institute for Environmental Studies needs, but many information comes from the other research institutions under the other ministries. In this sense, it's important to have a cooperation and collaboration with ministries and other institutions, research institutions, to develop this kind of information platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Shantanu Mitra from the UK Department for International Development. Very interesting set of presentations. I had one question, maybe most relevant for Paul Watkins, June Rentschler, or Nathan Reeve, but I don't want to restrict it. And I think you all made quite a compelling argument about the challenges of doing economic analysis of adaptation. I think you made, I like your quote, Paul, economists don't like adaptation and in doing project level analysis. But my question was more about, is it possible at all, is it to think about drawing any general conclusions about what kinds of adaptation or resilience are not the same thing necessarily, but investments at the global level make most sense, to think about prioritization globally, or is it just too locally specific? I guess, I mean, one could say you start with no regrets or low regrets, but even that, is it possible to generalize about what might fall into that category? So that's a challenge I think that we're struggling with a bit.
Okay. Are you happy to answer that now? Yes, Paul. Let's start. Well, we'll start at that end and then work round.
Yeah, that's a question that gets asked a lot. And I think there are some broad answers and then some specific ones. In broad terms, we now know that there are a suite of low regret options or no regret that are out there that we can do, particularly where there are options which address current climate variability and give us an immediate economic benefit, as well as building resilience for the longer term. So we're starting to see a large number of areas where we can invest in which are just good to do. And those might be weather and climate services through to early warning systems, through to certain types of cheap over design, whatever it is. And I think there's a growing evidence base on those. And at the same time, there's more development of adaptation as a pathway. And that we need to think about changing this to move away from thinking this is a one-off investment decision now only. And that does then start to link to things such as robust decision-making and real options, where you're trying to plan over time what you're doing with an adaptive management system that acts and learns and acts again. And we're also starting to get knowledge about what that is and get some quick wins there. But we're at the start of the journey, really. So in terms of those longer term issues, we're starting to put things in place. We're starting to learn lessons. And I think I will come back to this again, because this isn't just a technical challenge. It can quite often be an institutional or a process-based challenge. And we keep on coming against, we'll say, well, actually, we'll just update our hydro project in 20 years' time, but then we find that breaks the contract. And so you end up with a large penalty that means it's more difficult to do what you thought. So you have to think about this, especially if you're thinking from an investment perspective, about the whole process and about things such as how it links through to the programming and implementation. And we've tended to be a little bit cheeky by just sort of solving the upstream problems and not thinking this through all the way through. And if I give you one decision, if I want someone to do something on iterative adaptation in 20 years' time, I have to identify how that's going to work now, or else it just won't happen. So we're at a really interesting point where we're starting to learn a little bit more, but actually a lot of this is about delivering the adaptation itself as well as the technical options that we're picking. And I think we need to do both hand in hand. But
I'm slightly uncomfortable making global generalizations, I think. 2 points maybe that I would be comfortable to make. One is about the flexibility of projects. So given the uncertainty that we face, we need to be able to make adaptation choices that can be updated and improved later. So I think that's something to really keep in mind, no matter what you're looking at, to not lock yourself into a certain pathway just because you think right now that this is probably the way things are going to go. Another thing is to consider options which we may not consider if we simply look at the past, but we have to consider adaptation options that take into account the possibilities rather than simply the past. So I'm thinking about cities, for instance, that have not experienced any significant climate impacts, disasters in the past, but that very well may experience them in the future. And in those places, for instance, we would not consider investing in an early warning system simply because nothing has happened in the past, but it may still be a very smart investment to make.
Nathan?
Thanks.
Your name was also mentioned.
What's that? Oh, yes, of course. Yes. Not a lot to add to that. Although I just do want to point out a couple of things, and it goes back to the issue of prioritization and making sure that in the context you're in, you have a means and the tools to do that prioritization. But with adaptation, you don't have this nice, like you have with mitigation, a marginal abatement cost curve where you can pick off things one by one. So that makes the challenge a little bit more difficult. You also have long time scales, and certainly with countries that we deal with that have discount rates well above, personal discount rates well above and beyond what we use to justify our projects. Oftentimes you're harking back to the co-benefits of the investment. So things that they will see the benefits of now, and that oftentimes is a good avenue, which may not always be quantifiable, but is a good avenue to promote or justify an existing or the proposed investment.
Thank you. So another question from that side of the room, maybe? I was looking this way all the time. Then we have a question from down here, yes.
So thank you very much. This is a very good session. I would very especially thank, because this is economist, climate change adaptation specialist, and everyone is connected. So that helps. I'm Akhtaruzaman Sano. I'm working for a project, SPCR Cambodia, a strategic program for climate resilience. And we have good example of climate-proof infrastructure, road. So I remember 10, 15 years back, that area when the flood came, then one side water is high, another side water is low. And then that impacted because when the rice field loss, then how it impact to the community life. And after this project, now there is not that level of risk because the road constructed nicely and then the water crossing, there is a balance. So this is one of the good example of ADB contribution to Cambodia as a climate-proof infrastructure. So now under our project, we are doing annually the impact on Oman because of this climate friendly investment. So my question, a specific question to the economist from World Bank, what are the key elements at least we need to consider when we want to see the economic benefit? Because when flood affected earlier, it lost the crops, and then because of that risk, multi-risk generated. Right now, that risk is not there. Because of no risk, because of they are getting more agricultural products, so they are having more time to multiply economic benefit, to add value to this process. It's a complex structure, but I am sure economists may have good example. Thank you.
That question is directed to you, Jim, I think. Try another one.
Thank you. So maybe 2 points I'd like to make, and you probably all have something to add to that. The first are the kind of cascading indirect effects that you already mentioned, and I think these are often overlooked. So very often we think about a disaster and we simply look at the asset losses that happen. So we talk about the buildings that have been damaged and the replacement costs, but we don't really think about the well-being impacts that these kinds of damages have even in the very long term. So if you have a damaged road, it affects trade, transport, ability to commute to your job, access to markets, and so on. And these have very often, these indirect effects are much larger than the immediate direct asset losses. So we need to think about these well-being losses. A second point I'd like to add is that very often when we talk about adaptation and disaster risk management investments, we think about the avoided losses as the main benefit. But there's more than that. And what I mean is that when you invest in disaster risk management, even if a disaster doesn't happen after your investment for a very long time, you still have benefits from your investment. So you have, especially in dense urban industrial areas, for instance, you could have a real boost in investment. You have industrial growth, companies move in. So you have this kind of risk management stimulus to the economic activity. And that's something that's quite difficult to capture and measure quantitatively, but that's something that's very important, and that gives an additional economic rationale to investing in adaptation and DRM.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what you've just said, Jean, really speaks to the project that I'm in, was describing the systems thinking. And I think your examples as well demonstrate that degree of complexity that it's particularly at national scale and for such a complex problem as climate change, there's a risk of being blinded by it. And it's what I was saying in my presentation earlier, that when you take those problems and distill them down to a development scale, you tend to ignore those complexities because it's too hard. And that's what we really hope this sort of thrust towards systems-based thinking. And we heard some of the work that the ADB is doing in that area as well earlier on today. I think that will really help to try and capture the benefits beyond avoided risk and those trickle down benefits.
Does anyone else wish to comment on that question? Yes, I think we're down to about the last question. Yes, go ahead.
Hello, I'm part of a climate investment team of the Climate Change Commission, and we do manage projects that are foreign assisted. And I was just looking at all your presentations, and really there are a lot of validations on what you said. And we've had projects who've done multi-scenario planning just to look at where there should be more interventions in. And I was just wondering, cost-benefit analysis really plays a large part of identifying, apart from monitoring and evaluation, all those tools, of identifying where really climate investments should go. And for a government agency like the Climate Change Commission, we anchor all our interventions on what we call a National Climate Change Action Plan. So there are 7 strategic priority areas there, and everything I think that Paul mentioned, look at the following, etc. He talked about where a lot of investments are now being put into, and he mentioned some on the lower portions. Would you say that, for example, in our team, we're mostly composed of monitoring and evaluation people with somebody like me who's part an economist but more a public policy person? Would it be beneficial for us to get somebody who'd be great with numbers, not really an economist but more of a banker? Or should we include more economists in our team? So this is really more the composition of the team that does climate investment analysis for a climate change commission.
Okay. I don't know where we want to begin with that. Li Ping, you're putting
for our experience of ADB when we doing a project, and right, the right way should be cost and benefit analysis, and we can decide, okay, to what extent the adaptation measure we will take. But in reality, it's always, the project team need to discuss, negotiate to government to see, because the government is the borrower, they are the executing agency. So in most of the case, right, there is the government, they say, oh yeah, we understand that because we provide all the screening, all the evaluation, assessment, give them, and then they are always the ones say, okay, we will just do it to this extent, the adaptation measures, because this is their money, their project already. But as a development agency, what we can do is that, okay, we provide them all the necessary, we call it decision-making information to help them.
Anybody else want to comment on that one? Paul?
Yeah, just as a rule of thumb, you should never ask a group of economists if you should have more economics and more economists, because the answer will always be yes. But I think the key thing to highlight is that what tends to happen with a lot of climate investment portfolios and pipelines is people think about the projects first, and then they try and go out and sell those projects. And there's an issue with bankable projects that actually sometimes it's better to work the other way around in terms of you need to think about what it is you're trying to do and who you're trying to sell it to. So if you're working with a national government, you need to look through and look at the medium development planning process and the national budgeting and look to see how you can mainstream in core development to try and access those budget lines. If you're applying to the GCF, you need to have a look and see what they require, and they will require some degree of economic and financial appraisal. And I think the key thing is to develop a bankable pipeline of climate investment projects with a resource mobilization plan, and then you bring in the skills that you'll need according to. And the really frustrating thing is that every different person that you go and ask says, well, I have a different form and I require different things. Some of them will say I need a hard CBA, some of them won't. And I think the key thing is that it's more about thinking about the supply and demand on your bankable project pipeline than it is just about the generation of the projects. And so I'd really encourage you to think about that. You don't have to have economists in the team to do that. You just need to be thinking about that whole pipeline process.
Okay, so the time's ticking away now, so I'm just going to, is that really, really quick? Can you be very brief, sir? You can. Okay, a very quick question from my
Thank you. I don't want to stand between you and lunch, and all of us and lunch, rather. My name is Bujang Dharmaji. I'm a senior advisor in Cambodia working on one of the ADB programs. My question is, like, while the presentations did touch upon the issue of monitoring and evaluation, and most of colleagues have done an excellent job in terms of understanding and making us understand on some of the M&E processes adapted across various institutions. Rather here, my sort of an understanding is that while monitoring is a process which goes on at the initial, midterm, and post project implementation, evaluation is a longer term process, because sometimes evaluation is more to do with outcomes rather than outputs. So when we talk about outcomes, it could be 5 years down the lane, 10 years down the lane, maybe 15 years down the lane. And as one of the examples that came from Cambodia, definitely it looks like the infrastructure built about 5 years back or maybe 10 years before is now practically usable. So how do we consider those benefits, which, for example, the project is over long before, but still we see the good efforts of ADB and other institutions. So how do we catch up on those and show that as success stories for our adaptation? Thank you.
Good question. Yeah, so it's a knotty question. Does anyone want to answer that? Shall I point at someone? Peter, you're smiling.
So you've asked the non-economist the question around capturing the benefits. So I'll try and answer from our experience as an engineering firm. And to be frank, we're very involved in the upstream planning, design, implementation process. We always plan for how to include evaluation. The success of the evaluation really comes down to who is doing the evaluating work and how ambitious they want to be. For example, the project in Cambodia, if you're assessing success on the sort of reduced maintenance costs, that's clear and it's easy to capture. But if you're assessing the success based on the reduced risk of flooding of adjacent neighbors and the potential political tensions that might ensue if one neighbor is flooded and the other one is not, those sorts of benefits, even though you've seen them realized, are still very hard to capture, and they're still very elusive. And it would take a very driven assessor to try and factor those in. And I think that's the concern, is that really a lot of the benefits of these projects, you try and plan for them initially, you probably miss out some, and at the capturing stage, you probably capture even fewer.
Yeah, and it's a time scale issue as well with adaptation. So we've run out of time, sadly, but I'm going to ask everyone for a very quick take-home message. Can we do it in the order that people spoke? So Li Ping, do you have a take-home message for people? Please use the microphone. No, you understand, but it must be very quick. A take-home message, one sentence you want people to remember.
One take-home message.
Shall I? I'll come back.
Yeah, one take-home message is that climate change is relatively new. So just like what we are doing in ADB is that we try our best to equip government, equip people with knowledge, with a database, with knowledge about climate change, with awareness, so can take home.
Okay. I want to say again that the information is the basis of everything. So information platform is still useful, but at the same time, I really realized that not just put the information is not enough. Need to clear guidance to how to use the information, how to use the evaluation or planning the information is important. So I will consider this issue when I back to home. Thank you very much.
Paul.
Yeah, I think mine was an extension of that. So I think we do need more information, but we need to think about that information in the context of decisions, recognizing that even in the resilience field, we have lots of different decisions because we make decisions differently now. And also that we need to think about the use of information in the context of the process and the organization that's using it, thinking about the user.
June.
Again, along the same lines, we have an unprecedented amount of data that's increasing every day, and probably when we meet in 1 year, it will be even a lot more. And we shouldn't fall into the trap of simply relying on it blindly and extrapolating, but we really need to use tools to make robust and flexible decisions that can work in the long run.
Nathan.
A lot of what's been discussed today and also generally about adaptation is about actually talking about the supply of adaptation. What does information provide? What is the information provider going to give us in terms of our supply of adaptation or capacity to adapt? but perhaps more focus should be on the demand for adaptation and across all the key stakeholders from the bottom up, from the stakeholders at the bottom, as well as perhaps the donors at the top in the case of foreign assisted projects. It could be actually that sometimes the demand is actually not fully aligned across those stakeholders, which can also be an impediment to investment. So as an economist, you would say demand and supply are equally important. So there you go.
And Peter.
I would say that my take home would be to be encouraged that from a practitioner's perspective, the private sector is becoming more and more involved in the arena and wants to do more, but that they feel potentially underserved in terms of deriving the outcomes that they want. And there are tools that are out there, and I think we can work on those tools and improve them and provide private sector stakeholders with the right information to make the correct decisions that need to be made. And yeah, I think the main thing is to be encouraged that private sector wants to be so involved now. That would be my main one.
So I'd just like to thank the speakers on behalf of everybody in the room. I think it's been a really interesting series of talks, and I think we've learnt a lot about information. And for me, my own personal take-home message is to just be a little bit careful with the use of data. Don't get carried away by how much data is potentially available, but just make sure that I restrict myself to the information that I really need to make the decision, and to worry about that and not to broaden the scope of my inquiry too far. And I think that's a really useful message for me in the work that I do. But you will each have taken away your own messages from these very diverse and entertaining and interesting and informative presentations we've heard this morning. So please join me in just thanking the speakers one more time. Thank you. Because I've seen that slide with that. Really good to have a chat. Yeah, we definitely work together in looking at some needed Copenhagen. Really good.
You want to chat later? Are you around next week?
I'm around this week. I'd really like to
That's good. My work.
Type 1 and type 2.
Internally, that's our use.
Okay.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we haven't figured out a better name for it.
Time appreciation, time of programming. Is that you or is that?
No. The client programming is my term.
Okay.
Type 1 and type 2 was the internal guy.
I'm just an independent. Yes. You got a card as well?
Okay. Sige.